For years, Americans were told they just needed to budget better, spend less, save more, be responsible. But in 2026, something changes. Cutting back is no longer a choice. It's mandatory. Rent, food, insurance, and debt now consume so much income that discretionary spending is collapsing on its own. This isn't a mindset shift. It's a math problem. And when an entire country is forced to stop spending at the same time, the economy doesn't slow politely. It breaks quietly. The idea that Americans are cutting back suggests choice. It implies discipline, restraint, or lifestyle adjustment. But what's happening in 2026 has nothing to do with preference. It's compulsion. Household budgets aren't tightening because people want to save. They're tightening because there is nothing left to cut without sacrificing stability. Fixed costs have expanded to the point where discretionary spending is being pushed out entirely. This isn't behavioral, it's mathematical. Rent absorbs more income than it did just a few years ago. Not because people upgraded, but because housing costs rose faster than wages. Even households that didn't move are paying more through renewals, fees, and insurance pass-throughs. For renters, the increase is relentless. For homeowners, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance have surged in parallel. Food costs haven't normalized. They stabilized at a higher level. Grocery bills that once fluctuated now feel permanently elevated. People aren't eating better or buying premium items. They're paying more for the same basics. Insurance has become a silent budget killer. Health, auto, home. Premiums rise regardless of usage. Coverage shrinks while costs climb. These are not optional expenses. They're non-negotiable. Debt completes the squeeze. Credit cards filled the gap when costs outpaced income. That gap is now closing. Interest rates turn temporary, borrowing into permanent obligation. Minimum payments rose. Balances stopped shrinking. The illusion of flexibility vanished. By 2026, millions of households are spending more just to stand still. This is the context in which spending cuts are happening. People aren't trimming luxuries first. They're eliminating categories altogether. Subscriptions disappear. Dining out collapses. Travel is postponed indefinitely. Clothing purchases slow to necessity only. Entertainment spending drops sharply. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're structural retreats. What makes this moment different from past slowdowns is synchronization. Everyone is cutting back at the same time, for the same reason. There's no offsetting groups spending freely to stabilize demand. That synchronization matters. When discretionary spending falls unevenly, the economy adjusts. When it falls universally, entire sectors lose oxygen. Businesses built on optional spending don't see gradual decline. They see sudden demand evaporation. Retail doesn't soften. It contracts. Restaurants don't slow. They close. Services don't plateau. They disappear. And because these sectors employ millions, the spending cutback feeds directly into job losses, which then reinforce further spending cuts. This is how a consumer-driven economy turns inward. What's happening now isn't a recession defined by shock. It's a compression defined by endurance. People keep working, they keep paying bills, they just stop participating beyond survival. This changes behavior at a psychological level. People stop browsing, they stop planning purchases, they stop rewarding themselves. The emotional relationship with money changes from opportunity to threat management. Even households that appear stable behave defensively. They've watched layoffs hit safe jobs. They've seen companies freeze hiring while posting record profits. They've learned that income security is fragile, even at higher pay levels. So they conserve. This conservation spreads quietly. It doesn't show up as panic. It shows up as restraint, as hesitation, as delayed decisions. Big purchases become indefinite. Cars are kept longer. Homes aren't upgraded. Renovations are postponed. Medical and dental care is deferred unless urgent. These decisions don't feel dramatic in isolation. Collectively, they reshape demand. And demand is the engine. For decades, the American economy relied on the assumption that consumers would always spend eventually. Maybe not today, but soon. That assumption no longer holds. Consumers aren't waiting for confidence to return. They're adapting to the idea that it won't. This adaptation is what makes 2026 different. Previous cycles had clear recovery expectations. Once inflation cooled, once rates fell, once growth resumed. People believed spending would rebound. Now, belief itself is fading. People don't trust that costs will fall meaningfully. They don't expect wages to catch up. They don't believe debt will become easier to manage, so they adjust permanently. That permanence is dangerous. When spending cuts become habits, industries don't bounce back quickly. Capacity shrinks, competition disappears, prices rise further due to consolidation, which pushes households even tighter. This is the feedback loop forming now. Cutbacks reduce demand. Reduced demand causes layoffs. Layoffs increase fear. Fear deepens cutbacks. At no point does this require panic. It only requires realism, and realism is spreading. What's especially telling is where people are not cutting. Rent is paid. Insurance is maintained. Debt minimums are met. Utilities stay on. Everything else becomes negotiable. This signals a shift from lifestyle economy to survival economy. In a survival economy, optional sectors don't recover organically. They require either income growth or cost relief. Neither is present in sufficient scale. Wages have not risen fast enough. Costs remain elevated. Credit is no longer cheap enough to mask the difference. So the system compresses. This is why the phrase cutting back understates what's happening. Americans aren't economizing, they're retreating. And that retreat doesn't stop at households. As spending collapses across optional categories, businesses begin to plan for a lower baseline. Expansion plans are canceled. Hiring freezes spread, investment slows. The economy doesn't fall apart, it hardens. It becomes smaller, tighter, and less forgiving. This is the environment in which 2026 unfolds. And as this pressure continues, it begins to reshape not just how people spend, but how entire industries operate, how work is structured, and how risk is distributed. As this forced pullback spreads, businesses don't respond with patience. They respond with protection. The first adjustment isn't layoffs, it's expectation. Companies stop planning for growth and start planning for survival. Forecasts are revised downward. Revenue assumptions are tightened. Expansion quietly disappears from internal conversations. This is where the optional economy begins to hollow out. Businesses built on discretionary spending were designed for abundance. They assume customers will return, upgrade, and indulge once conditions improve. But in 2026, improvement never arrives. Instead, demand stabilizes at a lower level and stays there. Restaurants feel it first. Dining out becomes occasional instead of habitual. Mid-tier chains suffer the most. They're too expensive to be cheap, but not premium enough to justify the cost. Traffic drops just enough to make margins unworkable. Closures accelerate quietly. Hours shrink. Locations consolidate. Staffing thins. Menus are simplified. Prices rise to compensate, which further pushes customers away. Retail follows the same pattern. Clothing, home goods, electronics, personal care, all face declining volume. People still buy necessities, but replacements are delayed. Good enough becomes the standard. Impulse purchases vanish. Retailers respond by reducing inventory, cutting labor, and closing underperforming locations. The mall economy contracts further. E-commerce doesn't absorb all the loss because even online spending is constrained. Subscriptions unravel next. Streaming services, fitness apps, premium memberships, once treated as small indulgences, are now evaluated ruthlessly. People cancel not because they dislike the service, but because the cumulative cost no longer makes sense. This matters because subscriptions were designed to be sticky. They rely on inertia. When people overcome that inertia at scale, it signals deeper financial stress. Companies notice this immediately. Churn increases, customer lifetime value drops, marketing costs rise as retention becomes harder. To compensate, businesses raise prices, bundle services, or cut costs. Quality declines. Support disappears. Value erodes. The cycle tightens. At the same time, credit loses its stabilizing role. For years, credit smoothed consumption. When income lagged, borrowing filled the gap. In 2026, that gap is no longer fillable. Interest rates make carrying balances expensive. Minimum payments eat into monthly cash flow. Households stop using credit for discretionary purchases. They reserve it for emergencies or stop using it altogether out of fear. This removes another layer of demand from the system. When consumers can't borrow and won't spend, businesses lose their final cushion. This is where layoffs begin to spread more visibly. Not dramatic mass firings, but persistent reductions, hiring freezes, contract non-renewals, reduced hours, role consolidation, attrition without replacement. Workloads increase for those who remain. Stress rises. Productivity plateaus. Companies frame this as efficiency. Internally, it's triage. This environment changes how employers view labor. Workers are no longer seen as growth drivers. They're seen as costs to be controlled. Flexibility is demanded. Stability is avoided. Long-term commitments feel risky. Benefits are trimmed. Raises shrink. Bonuses disappear. Career paths flatten. Workers feel this immediately. Job security evaporates. Even stable roles feel provisional. People stop expecting raises. They stop expecting advancement. They stop expecting protection. This uncertainty feeds back into spending behavior. People with jobs behave like people without security. They hoard cash. They delay purchases. They avoid obligations. The distinction between employed and unemployed becomes less meaningful. Both groups are constrained. This is how consumer confidence collapses without a crash. The economy doesn't stop functioning. It recalibrates downward. Companies adjust to lower demand by shrinking operations. They become leaner, not stronger, resilient, not expansive. This has long-term consequences. Investment slows. Innovation suffers. Risk-taking declines. Businesses prioritize short-term survival over long-term growth. The economy enters a holding pattern. What's most damaging is the feedback loop between fear and contraction. Households cut spending. Businesses lose revenue. Businesses cut jobs. Households cut further. At no point does this require panic. It only requires rational responses to constrained resources. This makes the cycle hard to interrupt. Policy interventions lag because the crisis doesn't look dramatic. There's no single trigger, no visible collapse, just steady erosion. People adapt individually rather than collectively. They downsize lifestyles. They delay goals. They redefine success as stability rather than progress. This adaptation creates a new baseline. Once that baseline sets, recovery becomes difficult. Businesses don't re-expand quickly. Workers don't resume spending habits easily. Trust doesn't return automatically. The economy becomes cautious. This caution is contagious. Industries that once thrived on optimism, travel, entertainment, luxury goods, struggle to regain momentum. Even when costs stabilize, demand doesn't rebound. Because the underlying issue isn't price, it's confidence. People no longer believe that spending today won't hurt them tomorrow. That belief was the foundation of consumer-driven growth. Without it, the system slows permanently. And as this slowdown hardens into structure, it begins to reshape not just markets, but social behavior. How people plan their lives, how they define success, and how they view the future. When financial compression becomes permanent, it stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like the new operating system. By this stage, Americans are no longer reacting to rising costs or shrinking options. They've internalized them. Expectations adjust downward. What once felt temporary becomes normal. People stop asking when things will improve and start asking how to endure. That shift changes everything. Spending restraint turns into identity. Frugality is no longer a phase. It's a survival strategy. People don't plan upgrades. They plan contingencies. They don't ask what they want next. They ask what they can afford to lose. This mindset spreads quietly across income levels. Even households that appear stable behave defensively. They've watched layoffs reach safe jobs. They've seen companies freeze hiring despite strong earnings. They understand that stability can vanish without warning. So they preserve. They keep cash. They avoid commitments. They delay decisions. They build distance between themselves and risk. This behavior doesn't show up as panic. It shows up as hesitation. That hesitation reshapes markets. When consumers hesitate, demand doesn't disappear. It weakens. Businesses feel it immediately. Sales forecasts soften. Inventory moves slower. Promotions lose effectiveness. Companies respond by tightening further. Investment slows. Expansion pauses. Hiring plans are shelved. Risk tolerance drops. Short-term survival outweighs long-term growth. This creates an economy that functions but doesn't advance. Growth becomes shallow. Productivity gains are extracted through pressure, not innovation. Efficiency replaces ambition. Workers feel this pressure constantly. More is expected with less support. Workloads increase. Margins for error shrink. Burnout rises. But compensation doesn't improve meaningfully because companies are protecting cash. The social contract erodes. Work no longer promises progress, it promises maintenance. This changes how people relate to time. Future planning becomes conditional. Long-term goals are postponed indefinitely. Home ownership, family formation, education upgrades, all filtered through financial fragility. Life decisions shrink to what can be safely maintained. This is how economic compression becomes cultural. When an entire society plans smaller lives, growth slows structurally. Innovation declines. Entrepreneurship suffers. Risk-taking disappears, not because people lack ideas, but because failure has become too expensive. The cost of mistakes has risen while the rewards of success have flattened. That imbalance discourages experimentation. This is why recovery doesn't simply arrive when inflation cools or rates fall. The damage isn't only financial, it's psychological. Confidence doesn't rebound automatically. Trust has been broken. People learned that systems don't protect them. That costs rise faster than wages. That debt isn't temporary. That stability is fragile. Those lessons don't unlearn easily. As a result, spending doesn't surge even when conditions improve marginally. People remain cautious, businesses remain defensive. Growth remains constrained. The economy enters a low expectation equilibrium. In this state, inequality widens quietly. Those with assets and buffers adapt comfortably. Those without margin remain trapped. The gap isn't just income, it's resilience. Resilience becomes the dividing line. The most troubling outcome isn't that Americans are cutting back. It's that they no longer expect abundance. They no longer believe effort leads to ease. They no longer trust progress to be automatic. They no longer assume tomorrow will be better. That belief once powered consumption, innovation, and social mobility. Without it, the system slows. This doesn't look like collapse. It looks like endurance. People still work. They still pay bills. They still show up. But they do so cautiously, quietly, and with lowered expectations. The economy keeps moving, but without momentum. and momentum is hard to rebuild once it's lost. This is why 2026 matters. Not because it's the year Americans cut back, but because it's the year cutting back became permanent. Not a strategy, not a choice, a condition. When a consumer economy reaches that point, it doesn't break dramatically. It contracts inward. And once contraction becomes the norm, recovery requires more than better numbers. It requires restoring belief, something far harder than adjusting interest rates or lowering prices. Until then, Americans will continue doing what they're already doing, not spending less because they want to, but because the math no longer gives them another option.